My stepmother kept asking when I was moving out. She lost it when I told her who owns the house. So, my dad married Nancy 4 years ago, when I was 22. I'd been living in the house since I was born because it was my mom's childhood home that my grandparents left to her. When mom died of cancer when I was 17, dad and I just stayed there. The house was paid off and dad said it made sense to keep living there while I finished college. He never mentioned that mom had actually left the house to me in her will, and he was just staying there as my guardian until I turned 25. I didn't know about any of this until later. When Nancy moved in after the wedding, she immediately started redecorating. She said the house was stuck in the past and needed updating. She threw out mom's curtains, painted over the murals mom had done in the hallway, and replaced all the furniture with modern stuff from some overpriced store. Dad just let her because he said Nancy needed to feel comfortable in her new home. She turned mom's craft room into her personal gym. She converted the guest room into a closet just for her shoes. The first time Nancy asked when I was planning to move out was 6 months after she moved in. She said I was old enough to be independent and it was weird for newlyweds to have an adult child hanging around. I told her I was still in college and couldn't afford rent anywhere. She said that wasn't her problem, and maybe I should get a job like everyone else. Dad said nothing. Nancy started leaving apartment listings on my bed every week, circled the ones she thought I could afford with my part-time coffee shop job. They were all in sketchy areas an hour from campus. She'd say things at dinner like when she was my age, she'd been living alone for years already. She kept asking how I expected to grow up if Daddy was still taking care of me. The second year, Nancy got more aggressive. She'd change the locks and forget to give me a new key. I'd have to wait outside until someone came home. She said it was practice for when I had my own place. She put a lock on the refrigerator and said I needed to buy my own food since I was basically a tenant. She started charging me rent, $200 a month that she said was teaching me responsibility. Dad went along with all of it. Nancy told everyone at family dinners that I was refusing to launch, and she was worried about my development. She'd say things like some people just need more pushing to leave the nest. My relatives started asking me why I was still living at home. Nancy would answer for me saying I was scared of the real world. When I graduated college, Nancy threw me a party. Not a graduation party, a moving out party. She'd invited all her friends and family. There was a banner that said, "Finally flying solo." She'd even hired a moving truck for the next day. During the party, she gave a speech about how proud she was that I was finally becoming an adult and moving forward with my life. She'd already picked out paint colors for my room. She was turning it into her meditation space. I hadn't found an apartment yet because I'd just started my new job the week before. Nancy said I had 30 days and that was generous. She started packing my stuff while I was at work. I'd come home to find boxes in my room labeled things like kitchen stuff for new apartment and decorations for your own place. She put all of mom's things that I'd saved in boxes marked storage unit because she said I couldn't take everything to a studio apartment. 3 weeks into the 30 days, Nancy sat me and Dad down for a house meeting. She'd drawn up plans to renovate the entire house once I left. She wanted to knock down walls, add a pool, completely gut the kitchen my mom had designed. She said it was time to make the house truly theirs instead of living in my mother's shadow. She actually used those words. Dad just nodded along. Nancy had already met with contractors. She showed us estimates. The renovations would cost about $300,000. She said they'd use Dad's retirement savings and take out a loan against the house. She'd already made appointments with banks. She said once I moved out next week, construction would start immediately. That's when I finally told her. I said she couldn't take a loan against the house because the house was mine. Mom left it to me in her will. I'd be inheriting it officially on my 25th birthday, which was in 2 months. Dad was just staying there as a courtesy from me. Nancy laughed. She actually laughed and said I was delusional. I pulled out Mom's will that I'd gotten from the lawyer the week before when I started asking questions about why Nancy was so obsessed with renovating. Nancy read it 3 times. Her face went from red to white to purple. She kept staring at the paper in her hands, reading it over and over like the words might change if she looked hard enough. The silence stretched out so long I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the other room. Then Nancy's face twisted up and she crushed the will into a tight ball with both hands. She threw it right at my face and it bounced off my cheek. She started screaming that I was lying, that there was no way this was real, that I must have made fake documents somehow. Her voice got louder with every word until she was practically shrieking. She said there was no way Dad would have hidden something this huge from her for 4 whole years. She kept saying it was impossible over and over again while her face got redder and redder. Dad cleared his throat and said really quietly that yes, he knew about the will the whole time. His voice was so soft I barely heard him over Nancy's yelling. Nancy stopped mid-scream and spun around to stare at him. Her mouth hung open and her eyes went wide like she couldn't believe what she just heard. She asked him why he never told her she'd been living in his daughter's house all this time. Her voice shook when she said it. Dad looked down at his hands and didn't answer right away. Nancy took a step toward him and asked again, louder this time. Dad said he thought it would be easier to just not mention it. He spoke to the floor instead of looking at either of us. He said he figured they'd deal with it when I turned 25, and by then it wouldn't matter because I'd probably have moved out on my own anyway. Nancy's face changed from red to purple to this weird gray color. She pressed her hand against the wall like she needed it to stay standing. Her breathing got fast and shallow. I watched her brain working through what this meant. how she'd been decorating and changing and throwing out Mom's stuff in a house that was never going to be hers. Nancy's whole body seemed to collapse in on itself. She sat down hard on one of the dining chairs she'd bought 2 years ago. Tears started running down her face and her voice got all high and whiny. She said she'd invested so much money into this house over 4 years. She said she had receipts for everything, all the furniture and paint and renovations she'd paid for. She kept wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She said I needed to pay her back for all the improvements she'd made to my property, without knowing it wasn't hers. She said it wasn't fair that she'd spent all that money thinking she was fixing up her own home. I told her I never asked her to throw out Mom's curtains or paint over the murals or replace all the furniture. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I said she did all of that on her own without ever asking my permission as the actual owner. Nancy's breathing got even faster, and she started making these weird gasping sounds. She fanned her face with her hand and said she couldn't breathe. She kept saying she couldn't believe this was happening. Dad moved toward her, but she held up her hand to stop him. Dad tried to put his hand on Nancy's shoulder, but she shoved him away hard enough that he stumbled back a step. She said he made her look like a complete fool in front of everyone at the moving party. Her voice broke on the word fool. She said she was so embarrassed that she'd thrown me an eviction party for a house that I actually owned, and she'd just been a guest in this whole time. She covered her face with both hands. Dad said her name softly, but she ignored him. She said all her friends and family were there, that she'd given that whole speech about me finally growing up, and now everyone would know she was the one who didn't have a clue what was going on. Nancy went completely silent and still. She lowered her hands from her face and her eyes got this cold, hard look. She asked me exactly when I turned 25. I told her in 8 weeks. She asked when the official ownership transfer happened. I said on my birthday. I could see her eyes moving back and forth like she was doing math in her head. She asked if there was any way to contest it, or if Dad could do anything to change it. Dad shook his head and said the will was clear and legal, and there was nothing anyone could do. Nancy pressed her lips together in a thin line and didn't say anything else. She just sat there staring at nothing while her brain worked through every possible angle. The next morning I woke up to complete silence in the house. I got out of bed and walked down the hall. The master bedroom door was closed, and when I tried the handle, it was locked. I knocked and called Nancy's name but got no answer. I went downstairs and found Dad asleep on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. His face looked gray and exhausted even in sleep. The whole house felt wrong, like the air itself was too heavy to breathe. I made coffee just to have something to do with my hands but couldn't drink it. Every sound seemed too loud in the quiet. I kept looking at the closed bedroom door upstairs and wondering what Nancy was thinking in there. I pulled out my phone and called Maya. She answered on the second ring and I told her everything that happened. She said she'd be right over. She showed up 45 minutes later with her camera and a notebook. We started in my room where Nancy had already packed half my stuff. Maya took pictures of the boxes labeled storage unit that had Mom's things in them. She wrote down everything Nancy had thrown away or destroyed that I could remember. We went room by room and I pointed out what used to be there before Nancy changed it. Maya photographed the gym equipment in Mom's old craft room. She took pictures of the painted-over murals in the hallway. We made lists of all the furniture Nancy had replaced. It took almost 3 hours to document everything. Maya sat down next to me on the couch and said I should probably talk to the lawyer who handled Mom's estate. She said I needed to understand my legal rights and what happens next with the house. I realized I had no idea who that lawyer even was. I was only 17 when Mom died and Dad took care of all the legal stuff. I told Maya I didn't know where to start looking. She suggested going through Mom's old papers to find the lawyer's name and contact information. We went up to my room and started digging through the boxes of Mom's documents that I'd saved from Nancy's purge. I found it buried under bank statements and old tax returns. A business card with gold lettering that said Henderson and Associates, Estate Planning. The card had a woman's name on it, Evelyn Henderson. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number before I could second-guess myself. A receptionist answered and I explained who I was and that my mom had been a client 7 years ago. She put me on hold for maybe 30 seconds. Then a woman's voice came on the line and said she remembered my mother's case very well. I told her what was happening with Nancy and the house and the will. She went quiet for a moment and then said she could see me tomorrow morning at 9. I thanked her and hung up feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time since the confrontation. Maya squeezed my shoulder and said she'd come with me if I wanted. I told her I needed to do this alone, but I appreciated it. We finished documenting everything and she left around 5. I made myself a sandwich but couldn't eat it. The house felt different now that I knew the truth. Every room Nancy had changed felt like a violation. Every piece of furniture she'd bought felt like an insult to Mom's memory. I went to bed early but couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Dad had known this whole time and never said a word. Around 7 that evening, I heard the bedroom door open upstairs. Nancy's footsteps on the stairs sounded heavier than usual. I stayed in the kitchen pretending to be busy with my laptop. She came in wearing a coat and carrying an overnight bag. She announced without looking at me that she was going to stay with Heather for a few days. She needed space to process what she was calling my betrayal. Dad appeared behind her looking exhausted. He just nodded when she said it. Didn't ask her to stay or try to talk to her. Didn't defend me or tell her she was being ridiculous. He just stood there like a statue while she walked out the front door. The silence after she left made me want to scream. I looked at Dad and asked him how he could just let her leave like that. He said she needed time to cool down. I told him that wasn't what I meant. I meant how could he let her treat me like garbage for 4 years without ever standing up for me? He flinched like I'd hit him. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. I stayed standing because sitting felt like letting him off easy. I asked him directly why he never told me about the house. Why he let me think we were just living here because it was convenient. Why he let Nancy believe she had any right to make decisions about a house that belonged to me. He looked up at me and his eyes were red. He said he was embarrassed. That he was almost 50 when Mom died and he didn't own a home. That all his friends owned houses and had retirement accounts and he had nothing. When Nancy asked about the house after they got engaged, he told her it was his because it was easier than admitting the truth. He said he thought I'd move out after college like Nancy kept saying, and then it wouldn't matter. He never thought she'd want to do massive renovations or that it would become this big of a problem. I asked him if he seriously thought I'd just abandon Mom's house. He said he didn't think that far ahead. He just wanted Nancy to see him as successful and stable. I told him that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. He nodded and said he knew that now. Then he told me something that made everything worse. He said Nancy had been spending money constantly for 4 years because she thought they owned the house together. She thought they had this big asset they could borrow against. She bought all that expensive furniture on credit cards. She paid for the gym equipment and the renovations with cards too. She kept saying they could afford it because they had equity in the house. Dad had been too scared to tell her the truth. Now they were in serious credit card debt. Over $40,000. He'd been using his retirement money to make minimum payments. He had almost nothing left for actual retirement. I stared at him trying to process this. I asked him how he could be so stupid. He said he knew. He said it over and over. I knew. I knew. I knew. Like saying it enough times would fix anything. The next morning, I drove to Evelyn Henderson's office in a building downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and paintings of sailboats. A receptionist led me back to an office with a big wooden desk. Evelyn was maybe 60 with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She shook my hand and said she was sorry for my loss even though Mom had been gone 7 years. She pulled out a thick folder from a filing cabinet. She said this was Mom's complete estate file. She opened it and started going through papers. She looked shocked when I told her Dad never informed me about the house inheritance. She said he was supposed to tell me when I turned 21. That was part of the trust terms. She'd assumed he'd done it because he never contacted her to say otherwise. I told her I'd only found out last week when I started asking questions because Nancy was acting crazy about renovations. Evelyn shook her head and said this was a serious breach of his duties as trustee. She explained that the house transferred to me officially on my 25th birthday. But technically, I'd owned it since Mom died. Dad was just the trustee managing it until I came of age. That meant Nancy had been living in my house as a guest for 4 years. Any renovations she did were basically gifts to me as the property owner. She had no legal claim to reimbursement unless she could prove I somehow tricked her into making improvements. Since I was a minor when this started and didn't even know I owned the house, that would be impossible to prove. I felt relief wash over me, but also anger that Dad had put me in this position. Evelyn said she needed to bring in her husband, because this was getting into property law territory. She left the room and came back with a man about her age. She introduced him as Arthur Henderson. He specialized in property law. Arthur sat down and read through some papers Evelyn handed him. He looked at me and said Nancy could potentially try to sue for the cost of her renovations. There were laws about unjust enrichment where someone improves property believing they have a right to it. But my case was different because I was a minor when most of this started. Dad was the trustee who should have informed Nancy. Since he failed in that duty, Nancy's case would be very weak. Any reasonable judge would see that I couldn't be held responsible for my father's lies. Arthur said that didn't mean Nancy wouldn't try, though. People sued for all kinds of things when they were angry. He asked if I had documentation of what Nancy had changed or destroyed. I told him Maya and I had spent yesterday photographing everything and making lists. He nodded and said that was smart. Arthur told me I should document everything Nancy changed or destroyed and get estimates for the value of Mom's original items she threw out. If Nancy tried to sue me for her renovation costs, I could countersue for the value of what she destroyed. He said Mom's hand-painted murals alone probably had significant value if done by a professional artist. The vintage furniture she'd replaced might be worth more than the modern stuff she bought. He offered to represent me if it came to that. I thanked him and said I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He said he hoped so too, but I should be prepared. People did strange things when they felt humiliated. Nancy had just found out she'd been living in her stepdaughter's house for 4 years while trying to force that stepdaughter to move out. That was a pretty big humiliation. I left the office feeling better about my legal position but worse about everything else. When I got home, Nancy's car was in the driveway. My stomach dropped. I walked in to find Nancy and Heather both in the living room. They had boxes of receipts spread all over the coffee table. Heather looked up at me with pure hatred in her eyes. She said Nancy had every right to be compensated for the money she invested in good faith into this property. I didn't say anything. I just stood there looking at all the receipts. Nancy was organizing them into piles. She didn't even look at me. She just kept sorting papers like I wasn't there. Heather kept talking about how Nancy had poured her heart and money into making this house beautiful. How she'd worked so hard to update everything. How it wasn't fair that she was punished for trying to make a home. I wanted to point out that it was never Nancy's home to begin with, but I kept my mouth shut. Arthur's advice echoed in my head. Document everything. Don't engage. Be prepared. Nancy finally looked up at me. She had her laptop open on the couch next to her. She turned it around so I could see the screen. It was a spreadsheet with dates and amounts and descriptions. She'd listed every single thing she'd bought or paid for in the house over 4 years. New furniture for the living room, gym equipment, paint and supplies for redecorating, new appliances for the kitchen. The total at the bottom said $85,467. She said this was what she'd invested into my property, without knowing it was mine. She demanded I pay her back before my birthday. If I didn't, she'd take me to court for unjust enrichment. Her voice was cold and flat, like she was reading a script. I looked at the spreadsheet and then at her. I told her I'd be happy to discuss compensation. Right after she compensated me for everything of Mom's that she destroyed. I walked to my room and grabbed the folder Maya and I had put together the day before. Inside were printed photos of Mom's hand-painted murals from before Nancy covered them with beige paint. Photos of the vintage furniture that used to fill the living room before Nancy replaced everything with her modern stuff. Photos of the custom curtains Mom had sewn herself that Nancy threw in the trash. I'd even found the original receipts from when Mom bought the fabric. Maya had helped me research similar vintage pieces online, and we'd printed out appraisal estimates. The custom curtains alone were worth about $3,000. The hand-painted murals would cost at least $5,000 to recreate by a professional artist. The vintage mid-century furniture Nancy replaced was worth more than $15,000 based on current market values. I walked back to the living room and dropped the folder on the coffee table right next to Nancy's spreadsheet. Nancy looked up at me with red eyes. I told her I had documentation too. Every single thing she destroyed or threw away that belonged to my mom. I said we could both get professional appraisals and see who actually owed money to whom. Nancy grabbed the folder and started flipping through the pages. Her face got even redder as she looked at each photo and each price estimate. Heather leaned over Nancy's shoulder to look, and her mouth fell open when she saw the numbers. Heather suddenly stood up and pointed her finger at me. She started yelling that I was an ungrateful brat who should be thanking Nancy for improving this old, outdated house instead of complaining about worthless junk. She said Nancy had worked so hard to make this place modern and beautiful, and all I cared about was some old furniture and ugly paintings. I just stood there and didn't say anything. Maya had been sitting quietly in the corner this whole time, just watching everything happen. She finally stood up and walked over to where Heather was standing. Maya told Heather very calmly that she needed to leave because this was between me and Nancy and my dad. Heather turned to Maya and asked who she even was and why she was here. Maya said she was my friend and she was here to support me. Heather laughed and said this was family business and Maya needed to mind her own business. Dad was still sitting on the couch looking completely exhausted. Maya looked at him and asked if he agreed that Heather should leave, so we could talk about this privately. Dad nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, Heather should probably go." Nancy's head snapped up and she stared at Dad like he'd just slapped her. Nancy started crying again and said she couldn't believe her own husband was turning against her. She said everyone was ganging up on her when all she'd done was try to make a nice home for her family. Heather grabbed her purse and told Nancy to call her later. She gave me one more nasty look before she walked out and slammed the front door so hard the windows shook. Nancy stood up and gathered all her receipts and her laptop. She told Dad he'd made his choice and she hoped he was happy. Then she walked to the bedroom and shut the door. I heard the lock click. Maya sat back down and let out a long breath. She asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't know. Dad put his head in his hands and just sat there not moving. I picked up the folder of Mom's things and looked through the photos again. Seeing all the stuff Nancy destroyed made me feel sick. The next week was the worst week of my life. Nobody talked to each other. Nancy stayed in the bedroom most of the time and only came out when Dad wasn't around. When I did see her, she was always carrying her phone and taking pictures of things. She'd photograph the new couch, the new dining table, the gym equipment in Mom's old craft room, her fancy coffee maker in the kitchen. I realized pretty quickly that she was building a case. She was documenting everything she'd bought, so she could prove how much money she'd spent. Dad moved around like a ghost. He'd go to work and come home and sit in front of the TV without really watching it. He looked older somehow. More tired. I tried to talk to him a few times, but he just said he didn't know what to say. On Thursday of that week, my phone rang while I was at work. It was Evelyn. She said Nancy's lawyer had contacted her office that morning. The lawyer wanted to set up a meeting to discuss property compensation and tenancy rights. Evelyn said we should meet with this lawyer together, and Arthur should be there too to protect my interests. I told her okay, and we set up a meeting for the following Tuesday. When I hung up, I felt like I might throw up. This was really happening. Nancy was actually going to try to sue me. At work the next day, Cody noticed I was distracted and kept messing up orders. During our break, he asked if I was okay, and I ended up telling him a short version of what was happening. His eyes got really wide when I explained about the house and Nancy trying to sue me. Cody said his parents had gone through something similar with his grandmother's house a few years ago. His aunt had been living there and thought she owned it, but it actually belonged to his mom. He said it got really ugly and took almost 2 years to settle. He warned me that family property fights can drag on forever and get super nasty. That made me feel even worse. Tuesday came and I met Evelyn and Arthur at their office. Nancy showed up with a lawyer I'd never seen before. He was a middle-aged guy in an expensive suit who looked really confident. We all sat down in the conference room and Nancy wouldn't even look at me. Her lawyer started talking right away. He said Nancy had been living in the house for 4 years and had made major improvements that increased the property value. He claimed Nancy had tenant rights since she'd been there so long and had invested so much money. He said Nancy was entitled to compensation for the improvements she made in good faith. Arthur stayed completely calm. He explained that Nancy was never actually a tenant because she never paid rent to me as the property owner. He said her husband was the trustee who should have told her about the ownership situation. Nancy's lawyer argued back that Dad's failure to tell Nancy the truth meant she made all those improvements under false ideas about who owned the house. Evelyn spoke up then. She pointed out that I was only 17 when Nancy moved in. I was a minor for the first year. Then I was a college student who depended on my father for everything for the next 3 years. She said I had no way to tell Nancy anything myself. She suggested that if anyone misled Nancy, it was my father, not me. Nancy's lawyer wrote some notes and said they'd need to think about that. The meeting went on for another hour with both sides going back and forth. Finally, Nancy's lawyer said they were prepared to file a lawsuit for $85,000, plus extra money for emotional pain. Arthur said we'd countersue for the value of everything Nancy destroyed, and for her making changes to my property without permission. The meeting ended with nothing solved. Nancy walked out without saying a word to anyone, and her lawyer followed her. I sat there feeling completely drained. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The whole drive I kept thinking about lawyers and courtrooms and having to tell a judge about my family problems. When I pulled into the driveway, Dad's truck was already there. I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going inside. The house felt different now. Like it wasn't really my home anymore, even though legally it was mine. I found Dad sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Older. There were papers spread out in front of him and he was just staring at them. I sat down across from him and neither of us said anything for a minute. Then he started talking without looking up. He told me he'd been using his retirement savings to pay off Nancy's credit cards. She'd been spending money like crazy on the house and he kept thinking she'd stop, but she never did. He said he has less than $30,000 left in his retirement account now. He's 52 years old. The way he said it made my stomach hurt. I asked him how much Nancy spent, and he said he didn't even know the total anymore. Too much. Way too much. I took a deep breath and asked him straight out if he knew Nancy was planning to take out a loan against the house. Dad finally looked up at me. His eyes were red. He admitted he knew she wanted to, but he didn't think she'd actually do it. He said he kept putting her off and hoping she'd forget about it. Then he said he definitely didn't know she was planning to spend $300,000 because that's completely insane. His exact words. Nancy must have heard us talking because suddenly she was standing in the kitchen doorway. I hadn't even heard her come downstairs. She announced that she was done trying to negotiate with me. Her voice was cold and flat. She said she's filing the lawsuit next week and she's already talked to her lawyer about it. Then she turned to Dad and told him he needed to choose. He could either support her case or support me, but he couldn't have it both ways anymore. Dad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He just sat there looking back and forth between us. Nancy's face got red and she started yelling. She called him a weak man who let his dead wife's memory control his life for 7 years. She said he was going to lose everything now because he couldn't stand up to his own daughter. Something snapped in me. I stood up and told Nancy she was the one who tried to erase every trace of my mom from her own house. I said maybe if she'd shown some respect for my mother's memory, we wouldn't be in this situation. Nancy crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and slapped me hard across the face. The sound echoed in the quiet house. My cheek burned and my eyes watered. Dad jumped up so fast his chair fell over backward. He told Nancy that was completely unacceptable. His voice was shaking, but he was finally standing up straight. Nancy grabbed her purse off the counter and said she was going to stay with her parents. She looked at Dad and told him to think real hard about whose side he wanted to be on. Then she was gone. We heard her car start and pull out of the driveway. Dad sat back down and put his face in his hands again. He apologized. For everything. For not telling me about the house when I turned 21 like he was supposed to. For letting Nancy treat me badly for 4 years. For being too scared to stand up to her until now. I told him I needed to know the truth about everything. That's when he admitted Nancy had been pressuring him to add her name to the house deed for the past year. She kept saying it was only fair since they were married. He kept putting her off, but he never told her the real reason why he couldn't do it. Because it wasn't his house to share. It was mine. Everything suddenly made sense. Nancy's aggressive push to get me out in the past 6 months. The moving party. The 30-day deadline. She wanted to establish the house as theirs before I turned 25. She must have sensed something was wrong with how Dad kept avoiding her requests about the deed. Maybe she even suspected the truth. That's why she was in such a hurry to get rid of me and start those renovations. If she could get me out and change everything about the house before my birthday, maybe she thought she could claim it was theirs? I sat there feeling sick and exhausted. Dad went upstairs and I heard his bedroom door close. I didn't move from the kitchen table for a long time. My phone buzzed. It was Maya asking if I was okay. I texted her back that I wasn't, and she said she was coming over. 20 minutes later, she let herself in with the spare key I'd given her freshman year. She found me in Mom's old craft room that Nancy had turned into her gym. I was sitting on the floor next to the weight bench crying. Maya sat down next to me and didn't say anything for a while. Then she started talking about how hard this was, but how I needed to protect myself legally. She said Nancy had shown over and over that she'd do whatever it takes to get what she wants. Maya reminded me that Nancy had been trying to force me out for years, that she'd changed locks and charged me rent and thrown me that horrible moving party, that she'd tried to take out a loan against my house without even asking me. Maya said I couldn't let Nancy bully me into giving up what my mom left me just because it felt bad to fight with family. Maya stayed with me until late that night, and we went through every single box Nancy had packed. I pulled out all of Mom's things and put them back where they belonged in my room. The craft room felt different now that I knew Nancy was trying to steal my house. Every piece of gym equipment looked like an insult. Maya helped me take photos of everything with her phone. We documented the weight bench, the treadmill, the yoga mats, all the stuff Nancy had crammed into Mom's space. Maya said I needed evidence of what Nancy had done to the house in case things got worse. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about how Nancy had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The apartment listings, the moving party, the renovation plans. She'd been building up to forcing me out so she could claim the house before I turned 25. Dad stayed in his room the whole night. I could hear him moving around up there, but he never came down. The next morning, I called Arthur's office before work and asked if I could meet with him alone. The secretary said he had an opening at 3 that afternoon. I went to work but couldn't focus on anything. Cody asked if I was okay and I just said family stuff. He didn't push. At 3, I drove to Arthur's office downtown. He had a corner office with big windows that looked out over the city. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit down in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Arthur pulled out a legal pad and asked me to tell him everything that had happened since the revelation. I went through it all. Nancy's meltdown, the slap, her staying with her parents, the threats about lawsuits. Arthur took notes the whole time, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the pad. He said Nancy's case was weak because Dad was the trustee who failed in his duty to inform her about the ownership situation. But that didn't mean she wouldn't try to drag this out and make it expensive and painful for everyone involved. Arthur explained that people like Nancy don't care about winning. They care about punishing. He said she'd probably file the lawsuit just to cost me money in legal fees and stress. Even if she lost, she'd feel like she won something by making me suffer. I asked what my options were. Arthur said we could let her sue and then fight it in court, which would be expensive, but I'd almost certainly win. Or we could try mediation first and see if we could reach some kind of settlement that avoided court entirely. He suggested that if we could get Nancy to drop her lawsuit in exchange for me not countersuing for the destroyed items, that might be the cleanest resolution. I sat there feeling sick about the idea of letting Nancy off without paying for what she'd destroyed. All of Mom's curtains, the painted murals, the furniture that had been in my family for generations. Arthur could see my face and he leaned forward. He said he understood how I felt, but a court battle could cost more in legal fees than I'd ever recover from Nancy. Plus, it would destroy what's left of my relationship with Dad completely. He said sometimes the smart choice isn't the satisfying choice. I asked how much legal fees would cost if this went to court. Arthur said probably $20,000 to $30,000 minimum, maybe more if Nancy dragged it out with appeals and motions. I didn't have that kind of money. I just started my job a week ago. Arthur said he could work out a payment plan, but it would still be a financial burden for years. I left his office feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about Mom's things that Nancy had thrown away. The curtains Mom had sewn herself. The murals she'd painted when I was little. The vintage couch that had belonged to my grandparents. All of it gone, and Nancy wouldn't even have to pay for any of it. When I got home, Dad was sitting in the living room. He asked if we could talk, but I walked past him to my room. I wasn't ready to hear whatever he wanted to say. My phone rang an hour later. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Nancy's mom, Danielle. She asked if I would meet her and Nancy's dad for coffee tomorrow. I asked why, and she said they just wanted to talk. I was suspicious, but I agreed because I was curious what they wanted to say. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near my work at noon the next day. I told Maya about it, and she said I should be careful, that maybe they were trying to manipulate me into giving Nancy what she wanted. But I had to know what they wanted. The next day, I showed up at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. Danielle and Rupert were already there at a corner table. Danielle waved me over, and Rupert stood up to shake my hand. They both looked uncomfortable. We ordered coffee and sat down. Danielle started by saying they'd had no idea about the house situation until Nancy told them last week. She said they were embarrassed by Nancy's behavior. Rupert nodded and added that they'd raised Nancy better than this. Danielle said Nancy had always been entitled and impulsive with money, which was one reason she'd been married twice before my dad. I just sat there listening. Rupert said they were going to talk to Nancy about dropping the lawsuit because they didn't think she had a case, and they didn't want to see her humiliate herself in court. Danielle added that they also didn't want to see their family torn apart over money and pride. She said Nancy was their daughter, and they loved her, but they could see she was wrong about this. I told them I appreciated their concern, but Nancy was an adult who made her own choices. Danielle reached across the table and touched my hand. She said they understood that, and they weren't asking me to forgive Nancy or pretend everything was fine. They just wanted to prevent this from getting worse. I thought about what Arthur had said about mediation. I told them I'd agree to mediation if Nancy was willing, because I didn't want to spend my 25th birthday in court fighting over my mom's house. Rupert looked relieved. He said he'd talk to Nancy tonight and try to convince her that mediation was the better option. We finished our coffee and they thanked me for meeting with them. Danielle hugged me before they left and whispered that she was sorry for everything Nancy had put me through. 2 weeks went by. I didn't hear anything from Nancy or her parents. Dad moved around the house like a ghost, barely speaking to me. Then Arthur called and said Nancy's lawyer had agreed to mediation. We scheduled it for the following Thursday. The day of the mediation, I called in sick to work. Maya wanted to come with me, but Arthur said only parties to the dispute and their lawyers could attend. I drove to the mediator's office in a building downtown. Nancy was already there with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit. Nancy wouldn't look at me. Her face was cold and blank. Dad arrived a few minutes later looking exhausted. The mediator was an older man named Gerald who explained how the process would work. We'd each present our side, and then he'd help us find a compromise. Nancy's lawyer went first, laying out all the money Nancy had spent on the house and demanding compensation. Arthur countered with documentation of all the items Nancy had destroyed without permission. Back and forth for 3 hours. Gerald kept trying to find middle ground. Finally, Nancy's lawyer admitted quietly that her case wasn't as strong as they'd hoped. The mediator worked with us to draft an agreement. Nancy would drop her lawsuit and I wouldn't sue for the destroyed items. Nancy and Dad could continue living in the house, but they had to be out within 6 months of my 25th birthday. Nancy couldn't make any further changes to the house. She had to return Mom's craft room to its original purpose by removing all the gym equipment, and Nancy had to pay me $500 per month in rent starting immediately until they moved out. Nancy's lawyer showed her the agreement. Nancy stared at it for a long time before signing. Her hand shook as she wrote her name. Nancy picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the agreement. Her signature looked shaky and small compared to her usual bold handwriting. She pushed the papers back across the table to the mediator and looked directly at me for the first time in hours. She told me in front of everyone that she would never forgive me for humiliating her like this and destroying her marriage. Her voice was cold and flat like she was reading from a script. I met her eyes and said I didn't destroy anything. I just told her the truth about who owned the house she'd been living in for 4 years. Nancy's face went red again and she opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, but her lawyer put a hand on her arm and she stayed quiet. The mediator collected all the signed papers and put them in a folder, then shook everyone's hands and said he hoped this would be the end of it. Nancy stood up fast enough that her chair scraped against the floor and walked out of the room without looking back. Her lawyer gathered her things and followed. Arthur stayed to talk to the mediator about filing the agreement with the court, while I just sat there feeling numb and exhausted. Dad hadn't moved from his chair. He was staring at the table like the wood grain was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. After Arthur finished talking to the mediator and we were getting ready to leave, Dad finally looked up at me. He asked quietly if we could talk privately sometime soon. His voice sounded rough like he hadn't used it in days. I looked at him and really saw how tired he looked. There were new lines around his eyes and his skin had this gray color that scared me a little. He'd lost weight too. His shirt collar looked loose around his neck. I realized the whole situation had aged him in just a few weeks. He looked older than I'd ever seen him before. Older than when Mom died even. I told him, okay, we could talk. He nodded and said he'd call me to set something up. Then he left through a different door than Nancy had used. The next week felt strange and quiet. Nancy stayed in the bedroom most of the time and Dad slept on the couch. I went to work every day and tried to act normal even though Cody kept giving me concerned looks. Maya texted me constantly to check in. The gym equipment was still in Mom's craft room and I walked past it every day feeling angry all over again. Finally, Dad called and asked if I wanted to meet for breakfast on Saturday. He suggested a diner across town, away from the house and away from anywhere Nancy would go. I got there first and sat in a booth by the window. Dad showed up 10 minutes later looking even more tired than he had at the mediation. He ordered coffee and didn't even look at the menu. We sat in silence for a few minutes while the waitress brought our drinks. Then Dad started talking. He said he and Nancy were probably going to separate. She couldn't get past the fact that he'd lied to her for 4 years about the house. Every conversation they had turned into her screaming about how he'd made her look stupid and how everyone must be laughing at her. She'd called her sister and her parents and told them all how he'd betrayed her. She kept saying she'd given up 4 years of her life living in someone else's house like a tenant. Dad looked down at his coffee cup and said he couldn't blame her for being angry even though she was taking it too far. The waitress came back and we ordered food neither of us really wanted. Dad waited until she left again, then kept talking. He said he should have told Nancy the truth from the beginning. He'd been ashamed of not being a homeowner at 48 years old. All his friends owned houses, and he was living in his dead wife's childhood home that belonged to his daughter. He'd liked feeling like a provider even though it was based on a lie. When Nancy wanted to redecorate, he'd let her because it made him feel like he had something to offer her, like he was giving her a home even though it wasn't his to give. He apologized for putting me in this position. He apologized for letting Nancy treat me badly for so long. He said he'd been a coward and he understood if I was angry with him. I watched him talk and felt this weird mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to hug him and tell him it was okay, but a bigger part of me was still really hurt and angry. I told him I did forgive him, but I was also really hurt that he'd chosen Nancy's feelings over my well-being for 4 years. I'd watched her throw out Mom's things and paint over Mom's murals and turn Mom's craft room into a gym, and he'd just let it happen. He'd let her charge me rent in my own house. He'd let her lock me out and lock up the food. He'd sat there silent while she told everyone I was refusing to grow up. Dad's eyes got watery, and he nodded. He said he understood if I needed time and space from him. He would respect whatever boundaries I needed to set. He just wanted me to know he was sorry, and he loved me. Our food came, but neither of us ate much. We sat there picking at our plates until finally Dad paid the bill and we left. 2 months felt like forever, and no time at all. The house stayed tense and quiet. Nancy started packing up her things bit by bit, boxing up her clothes and shoes and gym equipment. Dad helped her in silence. They barely spoke to each other. I stayed in my room or at Maya's apartment most evenings. Work became my escape. Then finally my birthday came. I woke up that morning and realized I was 25 years old, and the house was officially mine. Evelyn had called the week before to set up an appointment at her office to sign the final papers. I drove there feeling weird and shaky. Arthur was there too, and they had everything ready. Evelyn walked me through each document explaining what I was signing. The house was transferring from the trust into my name with no conditions and no trustee. I signed my name over and over on different pages. When it was done, Evelyn shook my hand and said congratulations. She said my mom would be proud of me. I almost cried right there in her office. The house was mine. Really mine. My childhood home with all its memories was officially and legally mine. Maya insisted on throwing me a birthday party that evening. She invited a few close friends from college and bought a cake and decorations. She came over early to help me set everything up in the living room. Nancy stayed in the bedroom with the door closed the entire time. I could hear her moving around in there, but she never came out. People started arriving around 7, and the house filled with noise and laughter for the first time in months. Dad showed up around 8 carrying a birthday card. He gave it to me and said happy birthday, then talked to a few people for maybe 15 minutes before saying he should go. The card had a long letter inside apologizing again for everything, and saying he hoped we could rebuild our relationship. He'd tucked $200 bills inside, which I figured was his way of paying back some of the rent money Nancy had charged me. After he left, I put the card away and tried to enjoy the rest of the party. Maya made everyone sing happy birthday, and I blew out the candles wishing that things could just feel normal again. The next month, Nancy and Dad started seriously looking for apartments. I'd hear them on the phone with landlords or see apartment listings on the kitchen counter. Nancy kept insisting on places that cost way too much. I'd overhear Dad trying to explain they needed to be realistic about what they could afford now. She'd get angry and say she wasn't going to live in some dump after living in a nice house for 4 years. Their arguments got louder and more frequent. One night I heard Nancy screaming that this was all his fault, and if he'd just been honest from the start, they could have planned better. Dad's voice was quieter, but I could hear him saying they needed to work together to find something. Eventually they settled on a 2-bedroom apartment across town that was smaller and cheaper than what Nancy wanted, but better than what Dad thought they could afford. They signed a lease starting in 3 months. I started reclaiming the house slowly, 1 room at a time. The hallway was first. I found old photos of Mom's murals that I'd saved and used them as references to repaint the designs she'd done. It took me 2 weeks working in the evenings after work. The colors weren't exactly right and my painting skills weren't as good as Mom's had been, but seeing her flowers and vines back on the walls made me feel like she was there with me. Next, I tackled the craft room. I made Nancy move all her gym equipment out to the garage. Once the room was empty, I painted the walls back to the soft yellow Mom had chosen. I bought some basic craft supplies and set up a small work table. I didn't know if I'd actually use the room for crafting, but having it back to its original purpose felt important. Each change I made felt like honoring Mom's memory, while also making the space mine. The house was starting to feel like home again instead of a battleground. Cody from work had been asking me questions about how I was doing for weeks. He'd noticed I was stressed and distracted. One day during our lunch break, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime outside of work. I was surprised to realize I was interested. We went to a coffee shop near my house that Saturday and talked for 2 hours. He told me about his family and his hobbies and asked about mine. When I mentioned the house situation, he listened without judging and said his own family had drama too. We started seeing each other casually after that. He was patient with the fact that I was dealing with family stuff and not fully emotionally available yet. We'd get coffee or see movies or just walk around talking. It was nice to have something normal and simple in my life. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, and he made me laugh, which I hadn't done much of lately. About a month after Cody and I started seeing each other, the doorbell rang on a Saturday afternoon while I was repainting the hallway. I opened the door with paint still on my hands and found Heather standing there looking uncomfortable. She asked if we could talk, and I almost said no, but something in her face made me step aside and let her in. She sat on the couch and apologized for how she acted at the mediation, and before that. She said Nancy had always been like this, entitled and dramatic, and their whole family knew it, but they just went along with it because it was easier than dealing with her tantrums. Heather told me their parents had been bailing Nancy out of bad decisions since she was a teenager, and she'd been married twice before my dad. both times to men with money who got tired of her spending habits. She said she felt bad for not speaking up when Nancy was treating me badly, because she knew it was wrong, but Nancy was her sister, and family loyalty felt important at the time. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and kept listening. Heather shifted in her seat and told me that Nancy and Dad were definitely getting divorced. She said Nancy had already met someone new at her gym, some guy who owned a car dealership and drove a fancy sports car. Heather looked embarrassed when she said Nancy had been seeing this guy for at least a month already, maybe longer, and she'd moved on so fast it made Heather ashamed of her own sister. She wanted me to know that not everyone in their family thought Nancy was right about the house situation. Her parents felt terrible about the whole thing, and Rupert had even said Nancy got what she deserved for being so pushy and entitled. Heather stayed for another 20 minutes making awkward small talk before she left, and I felt weird about the whole conversation, but also a little relieved that someone from Nancy's side had acknowledged how messed up everything had been. 4 months after my birthday, moving day finally arrived. I took the day off work to be there even though I didn't really want to witness it. Nancy and Dad had packed everything over the past few weeks, and the apartment they'd rented was small and plain, nothing like the house Nancy had been living in. The movers showed up at 8 in the morning and started loading boxes and furniture into the truck. Nancy directed them around without looking at me once, pointing at things and telling them to be careful with her expensive gym equipment. Dad moved slowly through the rooms looking tired and older than I remembered. He stopped in the hallway where I'd repainted Mom's murals and stared at them for a long time before moving on. The whole process took about 6 hours, and nobody said much of anything. When the truck was finally loaded, Dad came over and hugged me tight. He said he'd call me soon and we'd figure out how to stay in touch. He promised we'd work on fixing our relationship even though he knew it would take time. Nancy walked right past me to her car without saying a single word, got in and drove away following the moving truck. Dad gave me one last sad smile and left too. I stood in the driveway watching them go and felt relieved and sad at the same time. 6 months after I told Nancy the truth about the house, everything had changed. I'd bought new furniture that I picked out myself, comfortable stuff that felt like mine instead of Nancy's modern, expensive pieces. Mom's craft room was completely restored with the yellow walls and a work table I'd set up with supplies. I'd even started learning to paint so I could maybe try doing murals like Mom used to. The whole house felt peaceful now, truly mine in a way it never was before. Dad and I met for dinner once a month at a restaurant halfway between our places. We talked carefully about safe topics at first, but slowly we were getting more comfortable with each other again. He told me about his new apartment and his job, and I told him about work and Cody. Our relationship was healing, but it would never be quite the same as before Nancy. I'd heard through Heather that Nancy and Dad's divorce was moving forward, and Nancy was already engaged to the car dealership guy after only dating him for 4 months. Heather texted me updates sometimes, and we'd gotten to be friendly, which was strange but nice. I was dating Cody seriously now, and he'd been over to the house a bunch of times. He loved it and understood why it meant so much to me. He never pushed me to talk about the Nancy situation, but he listened when I wanted to. Maya had helped me plant a memorial garden in the backyard for Mom with roses and daisies and lavender, all Mom's favorite flowers. Every time I looked at it from the kitchen window, I felt like I'd finally done right by her memory. The whole experience had been painful and messy, and there were still days when I felt angry at Dad or sad about how things turned out. But I'd stood up for myself and protected what Mom left me, and the house felt like home again.